The world has reached a point in time where our technological advances may have surpassed our ability to handle them. What was once a luxury has now become a necessity. Einstein said he feared a society where technology surpassed humanity. The computer industry has grown to heights that would rival George Orwell's 1984. What was once science fiction has become a science nightmare. It has the greatest minds in the world racing against a deadline that cannot be extended or stopped. What many are calling the beginning of the coming dark age.
So how's that new job of yours coming along?
Actually, it's going great. I love it. It's something so different.
Yeah, it's always, I like doing that.
Come in, it's open.
Sorry we're late.
Hi, let me thank you, Kevin.
Sure, Mom.
Hi, everybody.
Traffic's a nightmare out there.
Hey.
Oh, hi, Emily.
I think the whole city's out tonight, welcoming in the new year.
Hey, everyone. It's the New Year holiday show.
Having a good time?
Actually, I am. How about you?
Oh, yeah, I'm having a great time.
Good.
Yeah. Oh, hey, how's it going?
Good, what's up?
Well, this is it.
Yeah, end of the century and start of a whole new millennium. It's exciting, isn't it?
That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the end of civilization as we know it. Ooh.
Oh, no, you're not going to start talking about that Y2K crash again, are you?
What Y2K crash? What are you talking about?
Oh, come on. You know, the computer crash. You know, tomorrow supposedly is when all the computers are going to turn back to 1900. You know, supposedly everything, we're not supposed to have power, water. Everything that's affected by a computer is going to be gone.
Is the world going to come to an end tonight, Grandpa?
I wouldn't worry about it.
I think it's all a lot of hogwash, son.
Your move.
Keep me for the next day, Jerry.
Oh, Mom, don't pass us out. Mom, please, what are you doing?
Oh, all right. Now, come on. Yes, you got to put these on.
Hey, everybody, the ball's about to fall. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year!
Hey, Chuck, you forget to pay your cable bill?
Cable out.
Kim, would you hand me the phone? I'll call Tom and see if his cable is out.
Yeah, here you go.
Thank you. No dial tone. That's odd. The phone is out.
What's happening? What's going on?
I guess Chuck forgot to pay his electricity bill, too.
Here's a match.
Dramatic? Orwellian? Science fiction or science fact? What could cause this kind of devastation to a nation's infrastructure?
Well, initially I was very skeptical. A friend of mine started forwarding to me articles off the internet. I began to poo-poo them and dismiss them, and I really didn't think it was that serious until I began to do some very serious research and began to talk to actual programmers, people that are working on this problem. And all of them assured me to a man that this is a very significant problem, that the time is short, and we've got a lot of work to do between now and January the 1st, 2000.
The Y2K problem was caused by what amounts to a lack of space, a space shortage. The computers in the first days of computing had very limited storage as far as the disk drives, the memory that they worked with, and also the data was entered and the code was all entered on punch cards. And the punch cards had limited amount of space on them, 80 characters across. And as much of that space as they could save, whether on the punch cards, in memory, or in any kind of storage, any kind of magnetic storage, they took every effort to save that. And That led up to the problem we're faced with today, where they left off the two digits that did not seem to matter back then. The 1-9 off the date, the century didn't matter. Doesn't change that often. And programmers then, whether consciously or unconsciously, figured that this problem would be taken care of eventually.
Well, in October of 1997, I was speaking in Detroit and to a large group of people. And I had two friends at the meeting who were computer consultants and actually are doing a lot of the work on the Y2K fix, on fixing the Millennium Bug for the big three auto producers, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. And so I talked to these gentlemen, and I said, look, I think that there's really a lot of overstatement on this Y2K problem. It just simply can't be as bad as they say. Why are people, spreading all this gloom and doom? And these guys sat down and effectively said, you're stupid. You really don't understand the problem. These guys are working on the fix with the big three auto companies, and then they begin to expand my mind and point out to me that it's just huge. So I began to do my homework after that. They put me in contact with people at Microsoft, IBM, and a lot of the big companies that are either working on the fix or are working on it internally for their own problems. And as I began to talk to these people, I began to realize that the problem is huger than huge. It really is a big problem. Almost everyone who gets into the problem is finding that it just grows and grows and grows, and it's far more complicated, far more intricate, far more expensive, and far more time-consuming to fix it than anyone realizes when they get into that, and I found that with my own company as well.
Caspar Weinberger is another gentleman who has spoken recently about this, April of 1998 in Forbes magazine. He says it is widely known that most computers will have serious problems after midnight, December 31, 1999, because most of them, if the software is not fixed, use two-digit dating systems that report the 00 of the year 2000, Y2K, as 1900. And he says the chaos that could ensue has been reasonably well documented.
The term Y2K, the Millennium Bug, the silent bomb are all terms used to describe the self-inflicted computer virus that will potentially affect more worldwide computer systems than anything in man's history, with the exception of the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear explosion.
Honest with you, we're all hopeful that, the magic bullet will come along and correct this problem, and maybe it will. Maybe some brilliant, computer expert out there will figure out how to do it. Up until now, that person has not surfaced, and I hope and pray that they will.
I was with the Air Force Rocket Propulsion Laboratory from 1960 to 1976. Various positions such as Digital Computer Systems Administrator. Yeah, the proposal that there's a silver bullet would have definitely been put out if there were such a thing. Bill Gates and other people along this line would have been in the middle of it right now if there was any possible way of having programs automatically changed or modified. The fact is that anything like the way they're set up, there is no possibility of a silver bullet.
But the more I got into this, the more I realized there's not going to be a silver bullet solution. In fact, I would say that the myth of the silver bullet is the single greatest threat to getting this thing fixed right now because it's causing complacency, denial, procrastination all across America in government and in business. But we're not going to find a silver bullet, and I mentioned several reasons in my book, The Millennium Bug, but one of the most important reasons is that we have over 600 computer languages in current use. COBOL is about 70% of those, but even if we were to find a silver bullet solution for one language, we can't find it for the rest of them, at least all of them.
Well, our power grid is almost totally computer dependent. You've got about 6,000 power companies around the United States, not to mention 109 nuclear power stations. And as far as we can tell, most, if not all of them, are not compliant at this point. I think a number of them are moving rapidly towards getting compliant. The problem is they have done a patchwork quilt of programs and computer related things over the last 20 years that have not been well documented. Many of their systems are computer-wise are very, very antiquated. Many power stations or power plants will have as many as 10,000 chips. These are embedded chips. They're very difficult to get to. They don't know how many are not compliant, but let's say the national estimate of 5 to 10% is true. Those chips are enough to shut down the power companies by themselves. Now, we saw what can happen when the power grid goes down. Down in Auckland, New Zealand, in January of this year, the power grid went down, stayed down in Auckland, the largest city in New Zealand, for some 4 months. The whole city that was affected, that part was shut down. 25% of the companies in that area went down. What if the nuclear power plants are not compliant? The Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the latter part of 1999 will shut them down. None of them are compliant. They represent 22% of the total electric power in the United States. So your part of the country can be compliant, another part of the country can be non-compliant, and the non-compliant areas can pull down the compliant ones. So we're all tied into this power grid. We've seen the blackouts in the northeastern United States, in New York in recent years. In New England, we've seen what happened when a tree fell on power lines in the western states a year or two ago. So the power grid will affect everything else. If it goes out for a week, a month, we've got major, major problems.
Well, there's no question that the electrical power grid is the foundation of our modern way of life. There's nothing that we're more dependent upon than electricity. I mean, even computers depend upon electricity to run. In fact, if you stop and think about it, unless you've got electricity, you can't even keep the computers up to continue working on them after January the 1st, 2000. There is a Senate Special Committee on the Year 2000 Technology Challenge, which began public hearings on this Year 2000 problem, and the first order of business for them was the state of readiness of the electrical power grid. In preparation for that committee, they surveyed the 10 largest power utilities in this country, serving about 50 million consumers. What they found was very disturbing. Of the 10, only 2 had completed the preliminary assessment. That's the smallest part of any Y2K project, is figuring out how many systems are going to be impacted, and only 2 had completed the preliminary assessment. The other 8 had not completed that very first stage. None of the 10 had a contingency plan. 1 of the 10 stopped counting embedded chip systems when they got to 300,000 units. That prompted Senator Bob Bennett and Senator Christopher Dodd, who are the co-chairs of that Senate committee, to report the next day in a press release that if Y2K were tomorrow, we would lose 100% of the electrical power grid. So clearly, there's an enormous amount at risk, enormous amount at stake with the electrical power grids. Well, the FDIC, which regulates banks, has about 6,000 member banks. They claim that about 88% of their member banks are making satisfactory progress. There's several things that we need to note about that statistic. First of all, there's not one single bank in the U.S. that claims to be Y2K ready. So they may be making adequate progress, but the problem we've got is that most software development projects are not completed in time. In fact, Standish Group International reports, based on decades of research, that of all large and medium-sized software development projects in America, only 16.2% of them are ever completed in time.
This is an issue that's costing Chase about $250 million. We started working on it in early 1995, and in hindsight, I wish we started earlier.
Yeah, Chase Manhattan Bank, the nation's largest bank, pushes $1 trillion worth of electronic fund transfer payments through its system to other banks, and in fact to 2,900 other entities every single day. So the problem is that if you have a corrupt system or a corrupt computer on one system, it can propagate that corrupted data across other systems, crashing other computers along the way.
Alan Greenspan has expressed great concern about the financial system, from the Asian meltdown, which is coming our way, to Y2K, its impact on the banking system and so forth. We know that the leaders in the Fed and the whole banking industry are very, very nervous about Y2K. And as Alan Greenspan has said, either the banking system is 100% compliant or it's not going to work, because if it's 95 or 98% compliant, bad banks, bad data, bad information can pull down the good ones. So this is the problem. We have a banking system which is totally connected with computers. They're connected to the derivatives markets. They're connected to the commodities markets, to the securities markets, to other banks all over the world. And so we have to be 100% compliant. We won't be 100% compliant. Some of the large banks will not make it. Some of your smaller banks will not make it. And we know that a great deal of the banks outside the United States will not make it. And Alan Greenspan has made very strong hints in his testimonies before Congress in recent months that we may have to isolate the U.S. banking system from banks around the world that are not compliant, which means that our banking authorities believe that there's a possibility that the whole banking system of the world can go into gridlock in the next year or so as a result of Y2K.
I was a member of the House of Representatives from 1979 to 92, and I remember I took a delegation of House members with me to meet with Chairman Greenspan in the Federal Reserve Office in Washington, D.C. He's not an alarmist by any means, and when he made these comments about the banking system, I mean, I think it's something that all of us should take to heart. And when he speaks, the world listens, and he's absolutely right, you know.
I'm a pilot for United Airlines. I spent 33 years in the cockpit of United Airlines. I had about 3,500 hours in the DC-10, then transitioned to the 747, which is today the big workhorse for the long-haul international flying for most of the major carriers. I see a very, very catastrophic thing happening because there's so much dependency on air travel today from the standpoint of business. The business world is really going to be hurt if the airplanes stop. Start off with the ticketing. The baggage is checked in, and there's systems of tracking the baggage, of putting the baggage on the airplane, and everything is done today by computer. Some of these things they could go back and do it by hand. It would slow things down, but that wouldn't necessarily stop it. Flight plans for quite a few years now, over 20 years, have been computer generated. I don't know of anyone that's flying today that would be able to immediately go and sit down and make out a handwritten flight plan. Some of the airlines are using GPS, it's global positioning system of navigation, using the satellites. Now when we start getting into there, you're totally dependent on computers because of the computer chips in the satellite and the GPS receiver that you have on the airplane. A computer problem, a computer glitch that anything that would cause the computer to give you bad information, or if the computer's shut down, you would not be able to navigate. If you're using inertial navigation with the very latest airplanes, they would be compliant, so you would be able to navigate. But when it comes to ground dependencies, the ability of the airline to generate and to track you and maintain the flight planning, they would lose that capability. The capabilities of air traffic control, from what my understanding and what I've been able to hear, is very, very dependent upon computers, and they're way behind in being able to comply. And my understanding is that they are almost sure they will not be able to comply by the year 2000.
Year 2000 millennium bug will affect us all, with reports of airlines intending to ground their fleets on January 1, 2000.
I would certainly not make any plans to travel during that time at all. As a matter of fact, I foresee things possibly shutting down even before that. But if from the standpoint of planning a flight, I would not plan a flight. And if flights were available, if they were flying some, I personally would not get on an airplane at that time.
America's railway system is in real problems or in real trouble with respect to Y2K. Our railways today are completely computerized. You don't have manual switching. They eliminated a great deal of their manpower with computers over the last few years. You only have a few people running a very long train, maybe an engineer and a conductor. And if the computers go down, the railroads simply cannot run. They will run into one another. The engineers will get off and walk away from the trains. We still move massive amounts of our bulk grains, chemicals, coal, sulfur by trains in this country. Probably 75–80% of the total goods in this country are still moved by train. We know how computer dependent they are and how sensitive those computers are because of the merger that took place in 1996 between Union Pacific and Southern Pacific Railways. Everybody thought this was the merger from heaven. Well, maybe not, because they have not been able to merge their computer systems. They've gone into gridlock. They have 350,000 cars floating around the country every day, and they don't know where a lot of those cars are. It was so bad that in the fall of 1997, I think there was 40 million bushels of wheat and grain that sat on railway sidings in the state of Kansas. They never got picked up. They sat there all winter. They probably got eaten by rats before it was all over. So we already have a railway system that, because of computers and incompatibility between the computers of those two large railroads, is already in trouble. They haven't even had time to start working on Y2K. So Y2K can shut down the railroads in this country. The railroads, by the way, deliver the coal and a lot of the fuel that go to the power stations and the public utilities. So if the railroads aren't working, the public utilities will run out of fuel very quickly, and so it's kind of a chain reaction.
I didn't know that when farmers plant crops, they do it with hybrid seeds. And in other words, when they grow a crop with hybrid seeds, you'd think they'd take a portion of that crop and save it back for planting next year. Apparently that's not the way it works. They have to buy a whole new set of hybrid seeds. And what do you know? They buy those hybrid seeds, you know, through the commercial system that exists, which involves computers. And if they can't utilize that system because of this problem, then they can't plant anything.
Well, I think we're headed for major food problems and shortages in the United States. We know that we only have about 45 days of food reserves in this country, and I would think that that's probably not too different from the rest of the world. What happens when the food distribution system begins to break down? People had better be self-sufficient in food. There's several ways to do that. You can go out and buy dehydrated food, freeze-dried food. A lot of people are doing that right now. You can garden, raise your own food, but people have got to get geared up to do that. And as we all know, they have now gone to these hybrid seeds that do not reproduce themselves. And so you cannot reproduce crop to crop to crop, year to year. People need to be going out and finding, and there are still places that produce non-hybrid seeds, and I think everyone needs to get, in addition probably to having a supply, a year or so supply of dehydrated or freeze-dried foods, I think people need to have a large supply of seeds that will reproduce, of non-hybrid seeds that will reproduce, because I think gardening and producing your own food is going to be a very, very important part of surviving Y2K.
The federal government owns 25% of all the computers in this country. They've gotten started way late. They're making miserable progress. In fact, Congressman Steve Horn, he's the chairman of a House subcommittee on government management, information, and technology. And he used to be a college professor, and he's issuing a quarterly report card on the progress of 24 key federal government agencies. In a recent report, he gave them a big red F because 13 out of the 24, based on current rates of progress, are not scheduled to get their computers fixed until well after the year January the 1st, 2000. Among them, the Treasury Department, the Defense Department, and the Transportation Department. In fact, Defense is not scheduled to get completed with its most mission-critical systems, not all of its systems, just mission-critical systems until the year 2002.
The Secretary of Defense has told Congress how vulnerable the entire Western defense system is. The U.S. military will have an unreliable communications and command system beginning in the year 2000. If the communication capability of the U.S. defense system is not functioning the way it's supposed to, our whole stability in this country could be at risk.
People like Caspar Weinberger and others, former Secretary of Defense, have talked about the dangerous downsizing of the U.S. military, even as the Russians still have 25,000 warheads, which can be retargeted on the United States and totally destroy the United States in one afternoon. Now you factor in the Y2K problem and realize that our military is the most dependent organization or military in the world on computers, that our global positioning system could go down on August 22nd of 1999, and many of our weapon systems are completely dependent on this. That we have hundreds of thousands of programs which use hundreds of languages, and you realize that all of our weapon systems are incredibly vulnerable. Our nuclear missiles are incredibly vulnerable. Virtually every weapon system we have is. So the United States military is probably at greater risk than any military in the world. The Red Chinese military is not so highly computerized. The Russian military is computerized, but not to the extent that ours is. So you will have other military powers that may emerge more powerful than America over the next few years as our computers go down, and theirs either they don't have their computers, or they've already installed new computer systems.
But consider the IRS. They also didn't get started until late 1995. They've got 100 million lines of computer code to get fixed, and this is an agency that's been technologically challenged from the get-go. These are the guys that wrote over $4 billion off in a computer modernization project a few years ago. Their chief information officer walked off the job in January, and they're way behind the curve. But the Defense Department has over 1 billion lines of code at last count. In fact, Time magazine said that although the Pentagon began Y2K planning in 1995, repairs of the most vital computer systems were only 9% complete this last spring. The F-15 and the Navy's Tomahawk missile system are 2 of 34 as yet undebugged weapon systems. So clearly we have a problem with our national defense. We've bought into what I call in the book the myth of continuity, that pretty much today is going to be like yesterday and tomorrow is going to be pretty much like today, and life's going to go on in a series of uninterrupted days and prosperity and abundance like we're experiencing right now. And it's much like, and without trying to be overly dramatic, I think it's much like being on the deck of the Titanic. You know, we've got an economy that's second to none. We've got more affluence today than we've ever had in our history. And there are people who are implying, if not outright saying, God himself couldn't sink this ship. And I'll tell you, we're headed straight for an iceberg, and it's not going to be pretty.
The domino effect is the problem of falling systems. One system fails, but another is dependent on it, like a series of gigantic rows of dominoes, each within falling distance of another. So is the Y2K problem and its effects. No one can even guess what these effects will be. This is what makes the Y2K problem the most complex problem facing the world possibly ever.
The Y2K Millennium Bug Crisis, I believe, is the most serious financial, social crisis to hit the United States, economic crisis in our history, perhaps for all of Western civilization. I believe it has the potential to shut down our financial system, to throw our economy into gridlock, to trigger a depression which is in waiting. I believe that there's a rogue wave coming to our shores. We've had the Asian financial crisis. We have political scandals in Washington, now Y2K, and these are all converging on us in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. A rogue wave is one of these giant waves that occasionally forms in the Pacific, and it smashes everything in its way, and we believe that that is coming. So I believe that our whole way of life over the next 12 to 18 months will change dramatically. It may never return to what it has been. So I think Y2K has the potential for setting the stage for a new world order, for coming global government. I believe that there are people who will try to push us into a cashless society. I think there are plans on the drawing boards for a state of national emergency, which, like the state of emergency that was declared by FDR in 1933, will represent a tremendous socialist power grab, much more people control than we've ever known in this country. So I believe that we're facing a crisis that will change our country dramatically, and that people in general, and Christians in particular, need to understand this crisis. They need to be preparing physically, financially, and spiritually for a crisis that will change all of our way of life.
The first scenario I do talk about in the book, though, is what I call the brownout scenario. That's a scenario that basically assumes we get 90 or 95% of our computers fixed, and that we have some isolated system failures. We may even have the domino effect in operation, where some systems are crashed by computers that aren't compliant. But largely it's a scenario of inconvenience, of frustration, much like it would be today to live in rural Mexico or rural Russia, where the lights work sometimes, sometimes they don't. The phone system, sometimes you get a dial tone, sometimes you get a busy signal, sometimes you don't get anything at all. But if that happens, I see it lasting anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. I talk about in the second scenario in the book what I call the blackout scenario, and again, as we pointed out earlier, the linchpin is the electrical power grid. If you lose electricity, then you're vulnerable to simultaneous, multiple system failures that could in fact be catastrophic. If you lose electricity, you lose telecommunications, you lose water purification, food distribution, you lose much of the military infrastructure, because it in fact depends on the civilian infrastructure, particularly at the point of electricity. And so that's a system, or that's really a scenario where we have not only chaos but we have some panic and widespread fear. And if that happens, I see that lasting anywhere from a couple of months to even a couple of years. There is the meltdown scenario, which is the last and final scenario that I talk about in the book. It's one of those scenarios that I hope to God doesn't come to pass, but we need to look at it soberly and realize what's at stake. In the meltdown scenario, it assumes that we don't have the same moral framework or context that we had in the Great Depression. All you have to do is look at the Los Angeles riots or Hurricane Andrew or any other situation where we had a breakdown to see that people are immediately looting, that crime becomes widespread, and that we have a breakdown in the basic systems that we've come to depend upon. And so what happens in the meltdown scenario is that we have all these societal impacts, political instability and so forth, that leads to either anarchy or tyranny. Again, I don't think that's going to come to pass, but we need to realize that if we don't get in gear here and get this stuff fixed, a large portion of it fixed, we could in fact suffer that scenario.
He who has ears hear and understand. I don't think there's any question about that. This video, I think, is designed to do just that. Not to alarm people, but to alert them to this coming potential problem and to take action to protect their own family. What does that mean? Well, it's appropriate to have a supply of food on hand. How long? That depends on the size of the family, obviously. Because if the supply capability of the transportation system is adversely affected, food's not going to be available in that supermarket.
I think that there's financial preparedness, there's medical preparedness. I do believe in medical self-sufficiency, in alternate medicine and so forth. I believe that the medical system will fail. And we better understand something about biomagnetic medicine, about herbal medicine, nutrition, oxygen therapy, and so forth. So there's many areas of self-sufficiency that I do write about and lecture on. In the area of financial self-sufficiency, I think people had better be getting out of debt. Debt is the reason we had 1.4 million Americans go bankrupt in 1997. So reducing debt, becoming liquid are very, very important. I think you need to monitor your bank, S&L, or insurance company very closely to find out how strong or weak they are and how well they will do in a Y2K crisis. I believe people should be out of the stock market and equity mutual funds completely. We're looking at the most overpriced, speculative, dangerous stock market in U.S. history. I think people should reduce their real estate holdings to probably 25% of their net worth, and preferably I would like to see people have that in an urban or more rural setting or small town. I think that big city real estate is going to have problems as a lot of social upheaval comes along. I think people ought to have some gold and silver, perhaps 20, 25, 30% of a portfolio. They traditionally have done very, very well in times of financial and political and social turmoil, which we think are coming. And so I think that's a very common sense thing to have. I think everyone should have a year or more supply of dehydrated or freeze-dried food. I believe that the supplies of that over the next year or so will dry up. In fact, there's a major move taking place into that right now. I think people should have a second source of income, some kind of a cottage business, something they can fall back on if they lose their primary source of income. I think they need to have alternate sources of information. That's why I write my books and have my own newsletter, to try to give people a better understanding of the times in which we live. There's many common sense things I think we can do. As far as Y2K, you want to have backup records for your tax records, for your Social Security records, your bank records, your insurance records, your security records, anything like this where they may question your payments, what you've paid, what they owe, the monies you have. You need to have backup hard copy. Anyone who is not taking defensive action now, if you have a company, is probably going to be too late. There are many things you can do to get out of harm's way and be better prepared and be more self-sufficient, but time is not on our side.
What I recommend in the book, in the Millennium Bug, is to build an emergency preparedness library. You know, your best weapon against uncertainty is knowledge, and there's many things that our forefathers took for granted, knew how to do, that we simply in our generation have no knowledge of. Things like how to set a broken bone, or how to deliver a baby, or how to prepare water that we find so that it's safe to drink and doesn't make us or our family sick. How to dispose of waste in a way that doesn't make us sick. Those are the kinds of things that we need knowledge of, and there's a lot of good books, a lot of good resources out there.
When I look at this problem, when I think about it, I see a lot of irony. And because I see mankind has put his trust and his hope in a box he calls the computer. And he's arrogant and he's prideful in thinking that his technology is going to solve all the problems of the future, and we think that we've solved those problems, and along comes these two little tiny digits that kind of put us in our place, and they're causing such grief, headaches, and costing us a fortune to get them fixed and taken care of. And I just see a lot of irony in that situation.
Well, a lot of Christians came to China 30 or 40 years ago and told them not to worry, there would never be any pain or suffering in China because they were all going to be raptured out. Many of those Chinese Christians were very embittered when the pain, suffering, persecution, torture came, and in fact they were not raptured out. I certainly would like to see the rapture take place today. It would be a wonderful thing. I believe, however, that we are going to go through some very, very difficult times in the United States and around the world. And I think it's a little naive to think that because we're American Christians that we are exempt from suffering. Are we such a cut above the rest of the Christians in the world that God would never let us break a sweat? I do believe that we are moving towards a time of testing for Christians in America and all over the world. I believe that we're moving towards a time of persecution. I'm working on my own book on the coming persecution of Christians and traditionalists in America. And I believe that Christians need to be prepared for the difficult times which lie ahead. Joseph interpreted the dream through God's power for Pharaoh, and when they saw the 7 years of plenty to be followed by 7 years of famine, they accumulated food, they took common sense type measures, and many, many lives were saved. So I believe it's important that Christians and everyone understand the times, prepare for the times, and assume that we're going to go through very, very difficult times, because that's what I'm assuming, and I think we need to be prepared for same. It says in Proverbs 27:12, the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. I believe the prudent are those people in the remnant who do understand the times and want to be prepared, and I think the simple are those stupid ones that really don't want to be prepared, and I think will be hurt very badly.
All a responsibility to trust. You know, God's still on the throne. We don't need to lose faith or panic or fear. We can be patient and count on Him to provide for us in our time of need. Second thing is we have a responsibility to repent. You know, if there's one God among the pantheons of modern gods that reigns supreme in this culture, it's the God of science and technology. And the incarnation of that God is the computer. And I think, unfortunately, as Christians even, we've kind of let that bit of idolatry slip into our heart, and we've come to expect things out of technology in our modern society that God only can provide. And so I think that judgment begins first at the house of God, and we need to look inward and to begin to repent perhaps of the idolatry that maybe we're fostering in our own hearts. The third thing, the third responsibility that Christians have is the responsibility to prepare. You can't help anybody else, including your own immediate family, if you don't prepare. Paul says that he who does not provide for his own household is worse than an infidel, and we need to prepare for our family by preparing and laying up for the future, much like Joseph did in the Old Testament when he saw a famine coming. And the final responsibility we have as Christians is the responsibility to share. And this is truly what separates us from survivalists. We're not just in this for ourselves. We are our brother's keeper. We do have a responsibility to care for those, certainly in our own immediate family, for those who are the household of God. And beyond that, for people that we see on the course of life, I mean, it's really the lesson of the Good Samaritan. People that we encounter on the road of life who are in need, it's an opportunity to serve them and meet their needs.
This video is merely information. We make no definite claims as to what may happen at the turn of the century. We challenge you to study the facts for yourself and arrive at your own conclusion. Apathy and indifference, or prudence and preparedness, the decision is up to you.